The fire is still burning when the sick person begins to shiver. Outside the shelter, the night air is cold, but the body lying close to the embers feels strangely hot. Sweat beads across the skin. Breathing comes faster than usual. The muscles ache. Hunger disappears. Someone nearby presses a hand against the forehead and immediately understands that something is wrong, even though there is no word for bacteria, no concept of viruses, no thermometer, and no physician waiting beyond the darkness. There's only the unmistakable heat of fever, the weakness that follows it, and the frightening uncertainty of whether the person will rise again when morning comes. Long before humans can explain disease, they have to survive it. Fever is not itself a disease, but one of the body's most ancient defenses. When infection takes hold, the immune system can raise internal temperature in ways that make conditions less favorable for some pathogens and strengthen aspects of the body's response. Early humans could not know any of this. They could only observe the pattern a healthy person becomes tired, loses appetite, grows hot or shivers, perhaps develops a cough, diarrhea, swelling, pain, a rash, or confusion. Sometimes the illness passes, sometimes several people fall sick together, sometimes the weakest person dies first. Over thousands of generations, these repeated encounters turn illness into one of humanity's oldest mysteries. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story of ancient medicine does not begin in a temple, a library, or the workshop of a famous physician. It begins much earlier, among people who possess almost none of the tools associated with medicine today, yet already understand one essential fact: a sick human being often survives better when others refuse to abandon them. Evidence for that care reaches surprisingly far into the prehistoric past. Fossils belonging to earlier human relatives sometimes preserve injuries so severe that survival would have been difficult without assistance. Broken bones healed badly but completely. Individuals lived for years with damaged limbs, serious dental problems, or conditions that probably limited mobility. Archaeologists cannot reconstruct every moment of caregiving from a skeleton, and scholars still debate how much help any particular individual received. But some cases strongly suggest that vulnerable members of a group were fed, protected, or allowed time to recover instead of simply being left behind. That behavior matters because disease creates a peculiar challenge for a social species. A sick individual can become a burden. They may slow movement, require food they cannot gather themselves, and expose companions to whatever caused the illness. Yet humans repeatedly choose care. This tendency is not unique to modern Homo sapiens, and it may have roots among earlier hominins. Cooperation, already useful for hunting, child care, and defense, becomes a form of primitive medicine. A hand bringing water can matter as much as any herb. Shade during extreme heat, warmth during chills, food that is easier to swallow, protection from predators, and simple rest may have saved lives long before formal healing traditions existed. The prehistoric landscape itself also shapes what sickness means. Small mobile bands do not experience disease in the same way as later cities. Many infections that depend on large, dense populations cannot circulate permanently among a few dozen people. A pathogen may enter a small group, infect those susceptible to it, and then disappear because there are too few new hosts available. This does not mean hunter-gatherers live in a world free from illness. Far from it. Wounds become infected. Parasites thrive. Contaminated food and water cause gastrointestinal disease. respiratory infections spread through close contact, animal bites, insect-borne pathogens, childbirth complications, dental abscesses, and injuries can all become deadly. But the disease environment is different from the one that later emerges when thousands of humans begin living closely together. Even without germ theory, repeated experience can produce useful habits. People notice that certain water sources are safer than others. They learn that spoiled meat can bring sickness. They may observe that some plants ease pain, settle the stomach, encourage sleep, or reduce inflammation. Smoke drives away insects. Fire cooks food and destroys many parasites and microorganisms, though its users have no idea why heating makes some foods safer. The mastery of fire, therefore, is not only a revolution in cooking and protection, it quietly becomes one of the earliest barriers between humans and disease. The same is true of movement. A mobile group that leaves an area after water becomes foul, or animals die nearby, may accidentally escape a local source of infection. Seasonal migration can interrupt exposure to waste and parasites that would otherwise accumulate around permanent settlements. This does not mean prehistoric people intentionally practice epidemiology. The evidence remains incomplete. And it is dangerous to turn practical behavior into knowledge more sophisticated than the people themselves possessed. Yet survival does not always require understanding. Sometimes it requires noticing what seems to work and remembering it. Memory is especially powerful in communities without writing. Knowledge exists in bodies, habits, stories, and repeated action. Someone knows which leaves can be placed against an aching tooth. Someone remembers a root that causes vomiting and another that should never be eaten. Someone has watched a wound worsen when dirt remains inside it. Another person has seen that a sick child survives when kept warm and given water gradually. Much of this knowledge disappears without leaving an archaeological trace, which makes prehistoric medicine extraordinarily difficult to reconstruct. Stone tools survive. Wooden bowls, woven plant fibers, poultices, and spoken instructions usually do not. Occasionally, however, the earth preserves tantalizing hints. Plant residues can survive on tools or in dental calculus. Pollen and seeds appear in archaeological deposits. Ancient teeth reveal infections, nutritional stress, and patterns of wear. Bones preserve trauma, inflammation, and some diseases. Parasite eggs can remain in sediments or preserved feces. None of these discoveries provides a complete medical handbook, but together they reveal that prehistoric people inhabited bodies constantly under pressure from injury and illness. What they lacked was an explanation capable of separating symptoms from causes. Fever could follow an infected wound, contaminated food, malaria-like parasites, respiratory disease, or countless other threats. To the observer, the heat might appear to be the illness itself. The invisible biological struggle taking place inside the body remained completely hidden. And so humanity's first medicine begins with observation rather than theory. A hot forehead, a swollen wound, a person who cannot stand, a plant remembered from another illness, water carried from a cleaner stream, a place beside the fire kept open for someone too weak to gather fuel. These actions are simple, but they contain the foundations of nearly everything that follows diagnosis, nursing, pharmacy, hygiene, and the belief that illness can be confronted rather than merely endured. Eventually, as humans settle permanently, grow crops, keep animals, and build villages, that confrontation becomes much more difficult. Disease is about to gain something it has rarely possessed before vast numbers of human bodies living close enough together for infection to move from one person to the next without running out of victims. Long before there are clinics, written prescriptions, or professional physicians, healing already depends on something more sophisticated than instinct. It depends on accumulated memory. A group moving through a prehistoric landscape may know hundreds of useful details about plants, animals, water, weather, wounds, and the human body. Not because anyone has written them down, but because forgetting the wrong lesson can be fatal. The person who remembers which bark eases pain, which leaves irritate the skin, which roots are safe only after boiling, or which spring should be avoided after heavy rain, carries a kind of medical knowledge that leaves almost no direct trace for archaeologists. Yet the survival of prehistoric communities strongly suggests that such knowledge exists, changes, and passes from one generation to the next. The difficulty is that ancient healing is far harder to detect than ancient hunting. A stone spear point can survive for hundreds of thousands of years. A crushed leaf placed over an infected cut usually disappears within days. A wooden cup used to give water to a feverish person rots. A bundle of herbs burned to repel insects turns to ash. A healer's instructions vanish the moment the voice that carried them is gone. Archaeology therefore preserves prehistoric medicine unevenly, giving modern researchers fragments rather than complete systems. What survives in the record suggests care, experimentation, and familiarity with natural materials, but the evidence rarely allows anyone to reconstruct exactly what people believe those treatments were doing. One of the strongest clues comes not from medicine itself, but from survival after serious injury. Some prehistoric skeletons show fractures that healed over months or years. Others reveal degenerative conditions or missing teeth that would have made ordinary tasks difficult. One famous Neanderthal individual from Shanidar Cave in what is now Iraqi Kurdistan survived severe injuries, including damage to an arm and other long-term impairments. Researchers have debated the precise nature of those injuries and the level of assistance required, but prolonged survival strongly suggests that physical disability did not automatically mean abandonment. Similar cases from other prehistoric populations show people living well beyond injuries that would have temporarily prevented hunting, gathering, or independent movement. Caregiving becomes especially important during fever because one of the greatest dangers of illness is not always the pathogen itself. Dehydration can kill, so can exposure, starvation, or a secondary infection that enters through damaged tissue. A sick person who cannot walk to water may die even if the underlying disease would otherwise have passed. Someone has to bring the water, someone has to maintain the fire, share food, protect the shelter, and perhaps move more slowly for days. In small groups where every capable adult contributes to survival, this is costly behavior, yet humans repeatedly bear that cost. There is also growing evidence that prehistoric people deliberately consumed plants containing biologically active compounds. Dental calculus, the hardened plaque preserved on ancient teeth, can trap tiny residues of plants and other materials. Studies of Neanderthal remains, for example, have identified traces consistent with plants such as yarrow and chamomile in some individuals. These species contain compounds that modern humans have used medicinally, but interpretation remains cautious. Eating a medicinal plant does not prove deliberate medical treatment. It could have been food, accidental contamination, seasoning, or part of some practice whose purpose is unknown. Scholars still debate how confidently such residues can be described as prehistoric self-medication. Other evidence is easier to connect to practical health. Fire dramatically changes the microbial environment of food. Cooking meat destroys many parasites and pathogens. Heating some plants removes toxins or makes them easier to digest. Boiling water, where suitable containers eventually make it possible, can reduce infectious organisms. Early humans do not need to understand microorganisms to benefit from these processes. The effect is accidental from a scientific perspective, but from the perspective of survival, accidental protection is still protection. Wound care offers another likely field of experimentation. Cuts are common in a world of sharp stone, thorns, animal teeth, falls, burns, and constant physical labor. An untreated wound can become fatal when bacteria invade deeper tissue or reach the bloodstream. Prehistoric people probably clean at least some wounds simply because dirt, splinters, and broken material are visibly painful. Water removes contamination. Covering a wound protects it from further abrasion. Certain plant materials may reduce inflammation or bacterial growth, although identifying deliberate antiseptic practice in deep prehistory is extremely difficult. One substance with remarkable medical properties appears much later in clear historical evidence but may illustrate the kinds of discoveries humans could make empirically. Honey. Its high sugar concentration, acidity, and other chemical properties can inhibit many microorganisms, and some ancient societies eventually use it in wound treatment. Whether prehistoric humans routinely did the same cannot be established, but honey gathering itself is ancient. Rock art from later prehistoric periods shows people collecting honey, and encounters with wild bee nests probably reach much deeper into human history. A substance prized as food could easily have been tested on damaged skin, whether intentionally or by chance. The search for relief also encourages experimentation with substances that alter pain, sleep, digestion, or consciousness. Many plants contain chemicals powerful enough to produce noticeable effects after a single dose. Some reduce discomfort, others cause vomiting, diarrhea, sedation, hallucinations, or death. The boundary between medicine and poison is often only dosage. Without standardized measurements, prehistoric treatment involves risk. A healer may know that a particular root helps if a small amount is prepared in a certain way, while a larger amount becomes dangerous. That kind of practical knowledge can be remarkably precise even without chemistry. Animals may even have provided examples. Chimpanzees and other species sometimes consume particular plants or materials when suffering from parasites or digestive distress. Behavior often described as animal self-medication. Humans watching animals could potentially notice similar patterns, though direct proof of such learning in prehistory is absent. More importantly, humans themselves are capable of experimentation and long-term cultural transmission on a scale unmatched by other species. One person's painful discovery can become another generation's warning. Still, ancient remedies should not be romanticized. Some treatments almost certainly do nothing, others probably make illness worse. A plant associated with recovery may be credited even when the patient would have recovered anyway. People may repeat ineffective treatments because coincidence makes them appear successful. Without controlled comparison, it is nearly impossible to distinguish correlation from cause. This problem remains central to medicine for thousands of years. A healer can sincerely believe in a remedy because every survivor remembers receiving it, while those who died cannot report that it failed. Yet even ineffective medicine can coexist with highly effective nursing. Rest, warmth, hydration, basic nutrition, protection from further injury, and social care remain powerful forms of support. Many infections are eventually defeated by the body's own immune system. The healer does not need to destroy the pathogen directly, if the patient's body can endure long enough to recover. That may be the deeper secret of medicine before medicine becomes a formal discipline. Prehistoric people rarely cure disease in the modern sense. Instead, they create conditions in which survival becomes more likely. They feed the weak. They keep them near warmth. They remember plants that seem to ease suffering. They learn which places are dangerous and which foods cause sickness. They pass those lessons through families and communities. But memory alone eventually begins to acquire explanations. As populations grow and settlements become permanent, healing becomes tied not only to experience but also to stories about why disease exists at all. Illness becomes the work of spirits, offended ancestors, hostile forces, divine punishment, imbalance, or intrusion into the body. Practical treatment does not disappear. Instead, it becomes intertwined with ritual. And the person who knows plants may also become the person who knows how to speak to the unseen world. As villages grow larger and the dead are buried closer to the living, illness begins to acquire meanings that go far beyond the body. A fever is no longer only heat beneath the skin. A seizure is no longer only a frightening physical event. Sudden weakness, delirium, unexplained pain, and the mysterious death of an otherwise healthy person can seem like evidence that invisible forces have entered ordinary life. In communities without microbiology, anatomy, or a clear understanding of contagion, this conclusion is not irrational in the way it may first appear. Disease is invisible until symptoms erupt. It can strike without warning, move through families, disappear, and return. A person can share food with the sick and remain healthy while another falls ill days later. To people watching these patterns with no knowledge of incubation periods or immunity, sickness seems to behave almost like intention. This is the world in which the earliest recognizable healers begin to take on a special social role. They are not physicians in the modern sense, and there is no single prehistoric model that can be applied everywhere. Some may be skilled herbalists. Others may act primarily as ritual specialists. In many communities, the same individual could easily perform both roles, because practical treatment and spiritual explanation are not yet divided into separate categories. A healer may know which plant reduces swelling while also believing the plant works because of its sacred association. A fever may be cooled with water and herbs while an amulet is placed nearby. A wound may be cleaned at the same time that a protective ritual is performed. One action does not cancel the other. The archaeological record occasionally preserves traces of this intertwined world. Carefully arranged burials, unusual objects placed with the dead, pigments such as red ochre, animal parts, and objects worn on the body all suggest that prehistoric communities often understand health, death, identity, and invisible forces as connected. Yet interpretation is difficult. An ornament found beside a skeleton may have been an amulet, a status symbol, a personal possession, or simply part of clothing. Archaeologists can identify the object, but not always the belief attached to it. The evidence remains incomplete, and modern categories such as medicine, religion, and magic may divide practices that ancient people experienced as a single system. One particularly dramatic practice illustrates this uncertainty trepanation: the deliberate creation of an opening in the skull. Examples appear in prehistoric remains from several regions of the world, and some skulls show clear signs of bone healing around the opening, proving that at least some individuals survived the procedure for significant periods. The reasons are still debated. Trepanation may sometimes have treated head injuries by relieving pressure or removing damaged bone. In other cases, it may have been connected to seizures, headaches, altered behavior, or ritual ideas about harmful forces. No single explanation fully accounts for every example. The procedure sounds extraordinary because it requires cutting or scraping through living bone without modern anesthesia, antisepsis, or surgical instruments. Yet prehistoric toolmakers were capable of remarkable precision. Sharp stone blades could cut soft tissue extremely well, and repeated scraping could gradually thin cranial bone. Survival after such operations demonstrates both technical skill and the body's ability to recover under favorable conditions. It also suggests that ancient healers were willing to intervene physically when illness appeared severe enough. Most healing, however, was probably far less spectacular. It took place beside hearths and sleeping places, with materials gathered from the surrounding landscape. The growth of settled communities makes knowledge of a local plants especially valuable. Instead of moving through large territories, farmers become intimately familiar with smaller environments across repeated seasons. They know where particular herbs emerge after rain, which trees produce useful resins, and when roots are strongest. They can dry, store, grind, steep, or mix ingredients in ways that create an increasingly complex pharmacological tradition. Some remedies may genuinely help. Willow species contain compounds related to salicylates, although ancient use cannot simply be equated with modern aspirin. Aromatic plants may ease congestion or digestive discomfort. Certain tannin-rich substances can have astringent effects. Resins can sometimes form protective barriers over wounds. Many plants contain antimicrobial compounds in laboratory conditions, though that does not prove that ancient preparations reliably treated serious infection. The distinction is important. A substance can possess an active chemical compound and still be ineffective, inconsistently dosed, or dangerous in real use. Other treatments are likely to work mainly because they support the patient rather than attack disease. Warm broths provide fluid and energy. Fermented foods may be easier to preserve. Herbal infusions encourage drinking. Gentle washing removes sweat and dirt. Keeping an ill person apart, whether for ritual reasons or simple fear, can sometimes reduce transmission even when nobody understands why. Ancient societies repeatedly discover behaviors that have medical value without possessing a scientific explanation for that value. At the same time, ritual offers something medicine still struggles to measure: psychological structure during uncertainty. A serious illness leaves families powerless. A healer who performs a familiar sequence of actions creates the sense that something can be done. The patient receives attention. The community gathers. Fear is given a language and a procedure. Modern researchers must be cautious not to mistake emotional comfort for biological cure. But comfort itself can matter. Reducing distress, encouraging rest, maintaining social support, and persuading a frightened patient to accept food or water may contribute indirectly to survival. There is also a darker side to supernatural explanations. If illness is blamed on offended spirits, sorcery, impurity, or moral failure, the sick person may become feared or stigmatized. Some treatments may involve painful purging, blood loss, fasting, smoke exposure, or toxic substances. Practices that survive through tradition are not necessarily effective. Cultural memory can preserve harmful ideas just as easily as useful ones. This creates a pattern that will endure for thousands of years. Ancient healing does not progress in a straight line from superstition to science. Accurate observations exist beside mistaken explanations. Effective remedies are mixed with useless ones. Skilled caregivers may hold theories that are completely wrong while still helping patients through practical experience. A treatment may work for reasons no one understands, and another may be trusted simply because its failures are forgotten. As settlements become more permanent, these beliefs become more organized. Temples appear, specialist roles become clearer, knowledge begins to be controlled by families, priesthoods, and eventually written traditions. Disease is increasingly interpreted through systems rather than isolated events. But something else is changing at the same time, and it is far more dangerous. The village itself is becoming a new ecological environment. Human waste accumulates, grain attracts rodents, domesticated animals sleep near homes, wells and streams can become contaminated, more children are born, more strangers pass through, and infections have more opportunities to spread. The first healers are learning to fight sickness just as human society is quietly creating conditions in which sickness can become far more powerful than anything their ancestors had known. The transformation begins quietly. A cluster of houses appears beside a reliable water source, fields spread beyond them, grain is harvested, dried, stored, and guarded, goats, sheep, pigs, and cattle live increasingly close to human shelters. Children are born into the same settlement where their parents were born. Paths become permanent. Waste accumulates in familiar places. Food stores attract insects and rodents. A village that looks like one of humanity's greatest achievements also becomes something entirely new in evolutionary history, a dense, stable habitat in which infections can circulate through people, animals, food, water, and refuse, with opportunities that mobile hunter-gatherers rarely created on the same scale. Agriculture does not simply give humans more food. In many early farming communities, it changes what people eat, how closely they live together, how often they encounter animals, and how easily disease moves. Archaeological evidence from skeletons in numerous regions shows that the transition to farming is often accompanied by increased signs of nutritional stress, dental disease, and some forms of infection, although the pattern varies greatly from place to place. Agriculture eventually supports much larger populations, but the first farmers do not necessarily become healthier than the foragers who came before them. In some places, their diets narrow. A community that once consumes a broad range of wild plants and animals may come to rely heavily on only a few staple crops. Calories become more predictable, while nutritional diversity can decline. Teeth record part of this transformation with unusual clarity. Starch-rich foods adhere to the mouth and provide fuel for bacteria that produce acids. Dental cavities become more common in many agricultural populations. Ground grain can contain tiny particles of stone from grinding surfaces, wearing teeth down over years. Abscesses develop around damaged roots. Without antibiotics, an infection beginning in the mouth can spread into the jaw and, in rare cases, into the bloodstream. A toothache is therefore not merely an inconvenience. It can become a serious medical threat. The greater danger, however, lies in population density. Many infectious diseases require a steady supply of susceptible hosts. In a small wandering group, an acute infection can burn through everyone available and disappear. In a settlement containing hundreds or thousands of people, especially one connected to neighboring settlements, the pathogen gains far more possibilities. New children are constantly being born without immunity. Travelers carry infection between communities. Markets bring strangers together. Armies eventually do the same on a much larger scale. Roads that move grain, copper, cloth, and pottery also move microorganisms. Not every famous human disease emerges directly from domesticated animals, and older accounts often simplified this relationship too much. Modern genetics has revealed more complicated histories for many pathogens. Still, close and repeated contact with livestock undeniably changes human exposure to parasites and infectious organisms. Animal feces contaminate soil and water. People handle blood, hides, milk, meat, and carcasses, fleas, ticks, mosquitoes, lice, and other vectors find abundant hosts around permanent settlements. The biological boundary between human and animal life becomes more crowded and more porous. Water creates an especially dangerous contradiction. A permanent settlement needs it every day. The same river or well may be used for drinking, cooking, washing, watering animals, and disposing of waste nearby. Without knowledge of microscopic contamination, clear water can appear perfectly safe while carrying pathogens from fecal matter. Diarrheal illnesses become particularly deadly for infants and young children because fluid loss can become severe with astonishing speed. Ancient people may know that certain wells have a bad reputation or that sickness follows floods, but the causal chain remains hidden. Yet settlement also creates new defenses. Permanent communities can maintain stored food for the ill. They can support people whose primary role is not food production. A skilled healer can treat many patients over decades and build a much larger body of experience than a person traveling within a small band. Plants can be cultivated specifically for flavor, ritual, or medicinal use. Ceramic vessels allow liquids to be heated, mixed, stored, and transported with greater control. Mortars and grinding stones make it possible to reduce roots, seeds, bark, and minerals into powders and pastes. The same revolution that amplifies disease also expands humanity's medical toolkit. Boiling becomes especially important, even when its true value is not understood. Pottery allows water to be heated directly and soups to be cooked for long periods. Heating kills many pathogens and softens foods that sick or elderly people might otherwise struggle to eat. Fermentation also becomes widespread. Beer-like beverages, sour foods, and other fermented products are not sterile. But controlled fermentation can sometimes produce safer or more stable forms of food and drink than raw materials left to spoil unpredictably. It would be misleading to claim that ancient people routinely drank alcohol because water was always unsafe. That popular idea is far too simple. But food processing does alter microbial risks in ways that can sometimes favor survival. Another defense arises from the simplest possible observation some illnesses seem to spread between people. Ancient communities do not need a germ theory to notice that sleeping beside someone covered in lesions, handling a corpse, or entering a household where everyone is sick can be dangerous. Responses vary enormously. The ill may be cared for at home, moved elsewhere, avoided, ritually purified, or temporarily excluded from communal activities. Some of these responses are harsh, and some are driven by supernatural fear, but distancing can accidentally reduce transmission. Crowded settlements also force communities to manage waste. Archaeologists find drains, pits, latrines, designated dumping areas, and water management systems in many ancient societies. These features are not always created primarily for health. Smell, convenience, cleanliness, ritual purity, and urban organization can be equally important motives. Nevertheless, moving human waste away from living spaces can lower exposure to certain pathogens. One of the recurring themes in ancient medicine is that useful public health behavior often appears long before anyone understands the biological mechanism behind it. The human immune system is adapting as well. People who survive infections can sometimes acquire lasting or partial immunity, depending on the disease. Over many generations, Infectious environments can also influence genetic variation in populations. But such adaptation carries enormous cost because natural selection works through differences in survival and reproduction, not through compassion. A genetic variant that provides some protection against one disease may carry harmful consequences in another context. The modern distribution of certain immune-related traits still preserves echoes of ancient encounters with pathogens, though reconstructing those histories precisely remains difficult. For individuals living through these changes, none of this is visible as an evolutionary process. What they see is much more immediate. A child develops diarrhea after the summer heat. A worker cuts a foot in a muddy field and the wound swells. A family wakes coughing after an illness reaches the neighbouring house. A woman weakens after childbirth. A fever moves from one end of a settlement to another and then disappears as mysteriously as it arrived. The healer now faces more patients, more recurring symptoms, and more opportunities to compare outcomes. Certain treatments begin to be remembered not merely within families but within institutions. As villages become towns and towns become cities, writing finally appears in some regions. For the first time, fragments of medical thought can survive in the words of the people who practiced it. Along the Nile, where dense communities depend on a river that brings both fertility and disease, those fragments eventually become some of the most revealing medical texts left by the ancient world. They show a society still surrounded by gods and magic, yet already watching wounds, fever, pain, and bodily symptoms with a surprisingly practical eye. Along the Nile, illness unfolds inside one of the most organized societies of the ancient world. The river makes a life possible, but it also concentrates people, animals, insects, waste, and water into the same narrow corridor. Fields depend on the annual flood. Villages and towns cluster close to canals and riverbanks. Fishermen stand for hours in shallow water. Farmers work barefoot in wet soil. Families drink, wash, cook, and travel through an environment where parasites can move easily between human bodies and the surrounding landscape. Egypt's monumental architecture may suggest permanence and control, yet the ordinary body remains exposed to infection, injury, intestinal disease, dental problems, eye disorders, parasites, and fever. What makes ancient Egypt especially valuable to the history of medicine is not that its healers possessed modern knowledge. They did not. What matters is that some of their medical practices were written down, allowing later generations to glimpse how disease was actually approached. Several surviving medical papyri preserve treatments, diagnostic observations, recipes, and ritual formulas. Among the best known are the Ebers Papyrus and the Edwin Smith Papyrus. Though both survive from periods long after Egyptian medicine had already developed, these texts do not reveal a single unified medical system. Instead, they show a world in which careful observation and supernatural reasoning exist side by side. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is particularly striking because much of it deals with trauma in an unusually practical manner. Injuries are described according to observable features. The healer examines wounds, swelling, movement, and neurological signs, then assesses whether a condition can be treated, managed, or is likely beyond help. Even though the surviving manuscript dates to the 2nd millennium BCE, some scholars believe portions may reflect older traditions. Exactly how old those traditions are remains debated, but the method is unmistakable. Look at the body, compare symptoms, and make a judgment based on what can actually be observed. This is a different challenge from fever. A broken skull or dislocated jaw leaves visible evidence. Fever hides its cause. Egyptian healers therefore work with symptoms rather than pathogens. They notice heat, weakness, changes in urine or stool, pain, swelling, cough, digestive disturbance, and the condition of the skin. Treatments might involve plants, minerals, animal products, oils, resins, beer, wine, honey, or combinations of several ingredients. Some preparations are swallowed. Others are applied to the skin, inserted, inhaled, or used as washes. Among these substances, honey stands out because modern research confirms that certain honeys can inhibit bacterial growth and help maintain a moist wound environment. Ancient Egyptian medical texts include honey and wound preparations, often mixed with other materials. This does not mean Egyptian healers understand antibacterial chemistry. They may value honey because experience shows that some wounds treated with it appear to heal well. The same empirical process that shaped prehistoric medicine continues inside a literate civilization, only now the recipe can be preserved beyond the memory of one healer. Another commonly used substance is grease or oil, which can protect dry or damaged skin and help carry other ingredients. Linen dressings appear in wound care, creating physical barriers between injured tissue and dirt. Some Egyptian treatments involve washing before dressing a wound. Taken together, these practices can accidentally reduce contamination, although infection remains a constant danger, without sterile instruments, knowledge of bacteria, or antibiotics. Even apparently minor injuries can still become fatal. Egyptians also used plants with real pharmacological properties, but interpreting their effectiveness requires caution. Garlic, onions, castor oil, aloe-like plants, juniper, pomegranate, and numerous other ingredients appear in ancient remedies, or are known from Egyptian material culture. Some contain compounds that have measurable biological effects. Pomegranate, for example, later gains a reputation in several medical traditions for treating intestinal parasites. And portions of the plant do contain active chemicals, but the presence of an active compound does not prove that every ancient preparation was safe or effective. Dose, preparation, species identification, and the illness being treated all matter. One of the most serious problems in ancient Egypt is parasitic disease. Modern examinations of mummies and archaeological remains have found evidence for infections including schistosomiasis, a disease caused by parasitic worms whose life cycle involves freshwater snails. People become infected through contact with contaminated water. In an agricultural society built around irrigation, such exposure can be frequent. The disease may cause anemia, abdominal symptoms, urinary problems, organ damage, and chronic weakness. A sufferer can appear persistently unwell without any visible explanation for the tiny organisms responsible. Malaria also affects parts of the ancient Nile Valley, and molecular evidence from some mummified remains has been interpreted as indicating infection with malaria parasites. The precise prevalence across different periods remains uncertain, but mosquitoes clearly belong to the ecological world of the Nile. Fever arriving in cycles may have been experienced as a recurring and mysterious assault, one that could weaken entire households during certain seasons. Eye disease is another constant threat. Dust, bright sunlight, flies, and bacterial infection contribute to inflammation. Artistic depictions of heavily outlined eyes are famous, and cosmetics such as kohl have often been discussed in relation to both beauty and protection. Some ancient eye cosmetics contained lead compounds, and laboratory research has suggested that certain low-level lead salts may stimulate immune responses under specific conditions. Yet it would be misleading to turn this into a simple claim that Egyptian makeup functioned as an effective antibiotic. The real practices, mixtures, concentrations, and health effects were varied, and lead exposure itself can be toxic. The boundary between practical medicine and ritual is visible everywhere. Spells may accompany a drug. An amulet may protect a patient while a wound is physically dressed. Diseases might be associated with gods, hostile beings, or supernatural forces. Yet the same healer can still recognize that a particular injury needs bandaging. Modern categories encourage a choice between magic and medicine, but Egyptians often see no contradiction. A treatment can address both the physical body and the unseen cause believed to lie behind its suffering. Professional specialization also develops. Egyptian texts refer to healers associated with particular conditions or parts of the body, although modern translations and interpretations of their exact roles vary. Temple institutions preserve knowledge, and literacy allows recipes to become standardized more easily than oral memory alone permits. Yet household medicine probably remains enormously important. Most illness is not treated by an elite court physician. Families use familiar remedies. Older relatives provide care, and local healers manage ordinary sickness in ways that rarely enter monumental records. Hygiene also plays a complicated role. Egyptians wash frequently by the standards of many ancient populations, shave body hair in some contexts, use linen clothing, and value cleanliness for practical, social, and ritual reasons. Priests in particular follow demanding purification practices. These behaviors can sometimes reduce lice, dirt, and certain forms of contamination. But cleanliness cannot eliminate diseases carried by mosquitoes, parasites in irrigation water, contaminated food, or pathogens circulating through densely populated settlements. Egyptian medicine therefore reveals the central paradox of ancient healing with unusual clarity. People can make excellent observations while misunderstanding the cause. They can develop useful treatments within a theory that modern science rejects. They can improve survival without being able to explain why a remedy works. And they can combine a genuinely helpful substance with a ritual that has no direct biological effect. Then remember both as equally necessary. Across the desert to the east, another great civilization is recording illness in a different language and on a different material. There, symptoms are pressed into wet clay. The sick body becomes part of an elaborate system of signs, remedies, omens, and divine forces. Mesopotamian healers will inherit the same ancient problem Egypt faces: how to fight an enemy that can be felt everywhere but seen nowhere. In the cities of ancient Mesopotamia, sickness belongs to a world crowded not only with people, but with gods. Mud brick houses press against narrow streets. Canals carry water through settlements surrounded by irrigated fields. Grain is stored in large quantities. Animals live close to human communities, and merchants arrive from distant regions carrying goods, news, and sometimes disease. Fever can appear in a household with no visible wound and no obvious cause. A child becomes hot and weak. An adult wakes unable to stand. A patient begins coughing, vomiting, or trembling. To a Mesopotamian observer, the symptoms are real and measurable, but the source may lie beyond ordinary sight. Disease can therefore be treated as both a physical condition and a sign that something has gone wrong in the invisible order of the world. Mesopotamian medicine is unusually revealing because thousands of clay tablets preserve pieces of its thinking. Medical texts survive from different periods and cities, especially in later collections from Assyria and Babylonia. though many traditions are older than the tablets that preserve them. These texts include lists of symptoms, recipes, diagnostic observations, ritual instructions, and predictions about the course of illness. They do not present medicine as a modern science. Yet they show sustained attempts to classify disease and recognize patterns. A healer is not simply improvising beside the patient. In some cases, generations of accumulated observations have already been organized into written knowledge. Two kinds of specialists are often discussed in Mesopotamian healing. One is commonly represented by the term assu, a practitioner associated particularly with practical treatments such as drugs, bandaging, washing, and external applications. Another, often called the ashipo, is associated more strongly with ritual diagnosis, incantations, purification, and the interpretation of supernatural causes. The distinction should not be made too rigidly. Their roles could overlap. An ancient people did not necessarily divide physical and spiritual medicine as sharply as modern readers might expect. A patient could receive a herbal preparation and a ritual treatment without anyone considering the combination contradictory. This blending is especially important when fever has no obvious cause. If a wound is visible, the healer can clean it, cover it, and watch whether swelling increases. When fever appears without injury, explanation becomes more difficult. Mesopotamian diagnostic traditions sometimes connect symptoms with divine displeasure, hostile spirits, curses, broken taboos, or ominous circumstances. Yet the same text may describe the patient's temperature, appearance, behavior, appetite, breathing, urine, stool, or location of pain with striking attention. Wrong theory and careful observation coexist on the same tablet. Medicines are prepared from an enormous range of substances: plants, oils, resins, salts, minerals, beer, wine, milk, honey, and animal products can be ground, boiled, mixed, strained, rubbed onto the body, swallowed, inhaled, or used in washes. Some ingredients almost certainly have physiological effects. Others are inactive or potentially harmful. In many cases, the exact ancient plant names cannot be identified with certainty, making modern evaluation difficult, even when a species is known. Its concentration and preparation may be unclear. The evidence, therefore, does not support simple claims that Mesopotamian doctors possessed forgotten cures that modern medicine only recently rediscovered. What it does show is extensive empirical experimentation. Beer is particularly interesting because it appears not only as a drink but as a medium for medications. In a grain-based economy, beer is familiar, widely available, and useful for mixing ingredients. Its alcohol content varies, and ancient beer should not be imagined as identical to modern commercial beer. Depending on preparation, fermentation may help preserve certain mixtures or make some compounds easier to consume, but it is not a universal disinfectant. And there is no reason to assume that medicines mixed with beer are automatically safer or more effective. Oil also plays an important role. It can soothe dry skin, serve as a carrier for herbs and resins, and create a protective layer over irritated areas. Poultices and bandages appear in treatments for wounds and swelling. Some prescriptions recommend washing affected areas before applying preparations. Once again, practical measures may provide real benefit even when the theoretical explanation is supernatural. A lesser-known feature of Mesopotamian medicine is its fascination with prognosis. Healers do not only attempt to identify what is wrong, they also try to determine whether the patient is likely to recover. Diagnostic texts sometimes organize symptoms according to what they supposedly predict. Certain combinations are considered favourable, others dangerous. This is partly medical observation and partly divination. But the underlying impulse is familiar. Compare the present patient with remembered cases and estimate what will happen next. Such pattern recognition can become surprisingly sophisticated. If a healer has watched dozens of people with similar symptoms, experience may reveal that some signs usually precede death while others accompany recovery. Severe difficulty breathing, loss of consciousness, uncontrolled bleeding, or prolonged inability to eat could obviously carry poor outcomes even without knowledge of physiology. The problem is that reliable patterns become mixed with associations that have no causal meaning, such as the day an illness begins or an omen observed nearby. Without controlled testing, both can become part of the same diagnostic system. Mesopotamian communities also encounter the problem of contagion. Letters and administrative texts from the broader ancient Near Eastern world sometimes reveal attempts to avoid people or places associated with epidemic illness. The surviving evidence does not amount to a formal germ theory, and practices vary across periods. But people can plainly recognize that proximity sometimes matters. Avoidance, separation, or restricting movement can therefore appear for practical or ritual reasons. Scholars still debate how consistently such measures were applied and what ancient people believed they were preventing. Cleanliness and purification also overlap. Washing hands, bodies, objects, or spaces may be performed because impurity is understood spiritually, yet physical cleaning can remove contaminants. Burning aromatic materials may be intended to repel supernatural danger, while smoke can also affect insects. Though excessive smoke damages lungs and cannot be treated as a general medical benefit, ancient societies repeatedly stumble into this ambiguity. A ritual may accidentally help, do nothing, or cause harm, and the outcome alone rarely reveals which explanation the practitioners believed. The healer's greatest tool remains the patient's own capacity to recover. Many fevers resolve because immune defenses eventually control the infection. A treatment that provides fluid, food, warmth, or rest may help the body endure. But when the infection is severe, ancient medicine reaches a hard boundary. Sepsis, pneumonia, severe dehydration, malaria, infected wounds, and epidemic diseases can overwhelm even a carefully tended patient. Without antibiotics, intravenous fluids, oxygen therapy, or modern intensive care, survival often depends on age, prior health, immunity, pathogen dose, and chance. This uncertainty helps explain why ritual remains so powerful. When two patients receive the same treatment and only one survives, practical medicine alone cannot explain the difference. Divine will, fate, impurity, and hidden forces fill the gap. Yet observation continues accumulating beneath those explanations, preserved in clay in a way prehistoric healing never could be. Across the long routes eastward, other medical traditions are also taking shape. In South Asia, centuries of practice will eventually be organized into systems that place diet, environment, bodily regulation, drugs, and surgery within an elaborate theory of health. As in Mesopotamia, some ideas will prove enduringly practical, others mistaken, and many much harder to date than later tradition suggests. Farther east, across river plains, forests, dry plateaus, and trade routes connecting communities over enormous distances, healing traditions in South Asia begin to develop in forms that will eventually be associated with Ayurveda. The word itself comes to mean something close to knowledge of life or longevity. But the tradition is not born all at once and cannot be traced neatly to a single moment. Its surviving classical texts emerge from long processes of compilation, revision, and transmission. Some ideas are clearly ancient, while the exact dates of specific passages remain debated. What survives in the record suggests a medical culture increasingly interested not only in treating individual symptoms, but in explaining how diet, environment, digestion, behavior, bodily substances, age, season, and disease interact. That broader view is important because fever is rarely understood as an isolated event. In later classical Ayurvedic literature, fever becomes one of the major disorders discussed in detail, with different patterns distinguished according to symptoms and the theoretical imbalances believed to produce them. The underlying theory is not modern physiology. It is organized around concepts such as bodily humors or regulatory principles commonly known as the doshas, along with digestion. Internal balance and the qualities of foods and medicines, these explanations do not correspond to bacteria, viruses, immune signaling, or metabolism as science understands them today. Yet within that framework, physicians can still make careful observations about the patient's condition. Temperature is only one clue. Appetite, thirst, sweating, sleep, stool, urine, weakness, pain, mental state, skin appearance, breathing, and the timing of symptoms can all matter. A healer may observe whether a fever rises suddenly or gradually, whether the patient is dry or sweating, whether digestion is disturbed, and whether strength is returning. This kind of classification is valuable even when the explanation behind it is mistaken, because different diseases really do produce different clusters of symptoms. Diet becomes one of the central tools of care. A severely ill person may be given lighter foods, thin gruels, warm liquids, or preparations considered easier to digest. From a modern perspective, some of these practices may help simply because they provide fluid and calories without forcing a weakened patient to consume heavy meals. Hydration is especially important in illnesses involving fever, vomiting, or diarrhea. Ancient healers do not understand electrolyte physiology, but they can recognize that someone who stops drinking grows weaker. South Asian medical traditions also develop an extensive pharmacopoeia: roots, leaves, bark, seeds, fruits, resins, minerals, oils, and animal products appear in preparations that may be boiled, powdered, infused, mixed with honey, combined with clarified butter, or applied externally. Some plants used historically in the region contain compounds with genuine pharmacological activity. Turmeric, ginger, neem, long pepper, and numerous other species have attracted modern scientific study. Yet it is essential not to collapse traditional use into modern proof. A plant may contain an active compound without every historical preparation being clinically effective. Dosage, purity, interactions, and the actual illness matter enormously, and some substances used in traditional medicine can be toxic. The same caution applies to metals and minerals. Later medical traditions sometimes employ processed mineral substances in highly specialized preparations. Their historical development is complex, and some forms become much more prominent in later periods than in the earliest medical texts. Modern claims that all such preparations are safe simply because they are traditional are unsupported. Ancient medicine can preserve useful knowledge and harmful practices at the same time. One of the most remarkable parts of South Asian medical history lies in surgery. The tradition associated with the Sushruta Samhita describes numerous instruments and procedures, including the treatment of wounds, fractures, abscesses, and forms of reconstructive surgery. The date and textual history of the work are debated, and surviving manuscripts reflect later transmission. but the surgical material demonstrates a sophisticated concern with anatomy, technique, and post-operative care. Procedures involving cutting into infected swellings or draining collections of pus could sometimes save lives, because enclosed infection can become dangerous if pressure and bacterial growth continue unchecked. Wound management receives close attention. Cleaning, bandaging, removing damaged tissue, protecting the injured area, and monitoring signs of deterioration are all practices with obvious practical value. Some preparations include honey or oils, substances already familiar from other ancient medical cultures. Again, different societies do not need to share a scientific theory to discover similar techniques. The human body presents the same basic problems everywhere. Bleeding must stop. Broken limbs need stability. Dirty wounds become dangerous, and a person who cannot eat or drink will weaken. Sanitation also receives attention in broader South Asian traditions, though it would be inaccurate to imagine an ancient public health system identical to modern hygiene. Instructions concerning washing, elimination, clean surroundings, food preparation, and personal habits can be tied to social, religious, ritual, and medical ideas simultaneously. In some circumstances, these behaviors reduce exposure to pathogens even when practiced for reasons unrelated to microbes. The environment creates its own challenges. South Asia contains ecological zones where malaria and other mosquito-borne illnesses can flourish, especially where standing water is common. Monsoon cycles alter water quality and insect populations. Dense settlements increase the transmission of respiratory and gastrointestinal infections. Intestinal parasites, skin infections, contaminated food, and infected injuries remain familiar threats. Physicians can recognize seasonal patterns even without knowing that mosquitoes or microscopic organisms are responsible. This encourages an important kind of medical reasoning attention to place and season. Illness is linked to heat, cold, rainfall, diet, local water, and patterns of daily life. Some connections are wrong according to modern science, but others reflect genuine environmental relationships. Malaria does rise and fall with mosquito ecology. Diarrheal disease can increase when water supplies become contaminated. Heat affects dehydration. Seasonal food shortages weaken populations. Observing the calendar can therefore reveal meaningful patterns even when the invisible mechanisms remain unknown. There are limits everywhere. Severe bacterial infections still kill. A patient with septic shock cannot be rescued by herbal decoctions alone. A child losing large quantities of fluid through diarrhea remains in grave danger. Complicated childbirth, pneumonia, malaria, tetanus, and infected wounds can overwhelm both healer and patient. Treatment may also include purging, bloodletting, fasting, or other practices that weaken already fragile bodies, depending on the period and diagnosis. Still, South Asian medicine adds something important to the long history of survival: the idea that health belongs to an entire pattern of living. Food, rest, cleanliness, environment, digestion, age, and season are treated as connected rather than separate. The theory is ancient and often scientifically incorrect, but the habit of looking at the whole patient can preserve useful observations. Farther northeast, another medical tradition is organizing the sick body through a different vocabulary of balance, circulation, seasons, organs, and pulses. There, the healer begins to place extraordinary importance on information that can be gathered from a wrist, searching within the rhythm of blood for clues to a fever whose true cause still remains invisible. In ancient China, the sick body is increasingly read as part of a larger system. The healer watches the face, listens to breathing, asks about appetite and sleep, notices whether the patient is sweating, examines the tongue, feels the skin, and places fingers against the wrist. Fever is not treated simply as heat. It becomes a sign whose meaning depends on a pattern of other signs, and that pattern is interpreted through ideas about balance, circulation, environment, and the relationships among different parts of the body. The theories are not modern physiology, but the method depends heavily on observation. The classical tradition that eventually develops is built over many centuries rather than invented by a single physician. Texts associated with works such as the Huangdi Neijing emerge from layered traditions that scholars continue to date and interpret with caution. Later medical writings expand, reorganize, and sometimes contradict earlier ideas. This matters because Chinese medicine is often described as if it appeared fully formed in remote antiquity. In reality, it evolves constantly, absorbing new drugs, diseases, diagnostic categories, and regional practices. At the heart of many classical explanations are concepts such as qi, yin and yang, and functional relationships between organ systems. These ideas do not correspond directly to the anatomical structures or biochemical processes recognized by modern medicine. Yet the framework encourages physicians to search for patterns rather than treating every symptom in isolation. A fever accompanied by chills, headache, thirst, sweating, cough, diarrhea, or confusion may be classified differently depending on the combination and progression of signs. Pulse examination becomes one of the most distinctive practices. The healer feels the radial pulse at the wrist and attempts to interpret qualities such as speed, strength, depth, and rhythm. Some traditional pulse categories go far beyond what modern cardiovascular assessment can reliably support. But the basic act of checking the pulse has obvious diagnostic value. A rapid pulse can accompany fever, dehydration, pain, or severe infection. A weak or irregular pulse may indicate serious physiological stress. Even without understanding the heart's electrical activity or blood pressure, ancient observation can reveal when a patient's condition is changing. The tongue also becomes important. Its color, coating, moisture, and appearance are interpreted within traditional theory. Many specific historical meanings do not match modern diagnostic science, but some visible changes genuinely accompany dehydration, nutritional problems, oral disease, and systemic illness. Again, practical observation exists inside an explanatory system that modern medicine does not accept. Chinese pharmacology becomes extraordinarily rich. Medical texts describe hundreds of substances drawn from roots, bark, leaves, flowers, seeds, fungi, minerals, and animal materials. Over time, Materia Medica compilations become larger and more detailed. Preparation can involve boiling, drying, grinding, fermenting, soaking, or combining multiple ingredients into decoctions. Some remedies contain compounds with genuine biological effects. Others are inert, weak, or potentially toxic. One of the most famous examples is Qinghao, associated with species of Artemisia and later with the discovery of artemisinin, a powerful anti-malarial compound in modern medicine. Historical Chinese texts contain references to preparations made from the plant for intermittent fevers. This is a remarkable connection between traditional observation and modern pharmacology. But it should not be simplified into the claim that ancient physicians possessed modern malaria therapy. Preparation methods matter enormously. The active compound was unknown, and historical treatment was not standardized according to modern dosing. Still, the example shows that traditional knowledge can preserve clues of genuine medical value across centuries. Other plants are more ambiguous. Ephedra species contain compounds capable of affecting the airways and cardiovascular system. Rhubarb can act as a laxative. Ginger influences digestion and nausea in some contexts. Licorice contains active compounds, but can cause serious problems when consumed in excessive amounts. The ancient pharmacological world is therefore neither meaningless superstition nor a hidden collection of perfect cures. It is a vast experimental archive containing useful drugs, ineffective remedies, dangerous ingredients, and practices whose outcomes depend heavily on context. Heat and cold are central to many treatments. Patients may be encouraged to rest, drink warm liquids, alter diet, or avoid certain environments according to how the illness is classified. These recommendations can sometimes support recovery even when the theory is incorrect. Rest reduces physical demand. Fluids combat dehydration. Easily digested food may help a weak patient maintain energy. But other interventions can be harmful if they restrict drinking or encourage excessive sweating in someone already losing fluid. Acupuncture also develops within Chinese medical traditions, though its early history is complex and the archaeological record does not support every popular claim made about its antiquity. Later texts describe increasingly systematic needle practices. Modern evidence suggests that acupuncture may help with certain types of pain and nausea in some patients, but it is not a treatment for serious bacterial infection, malaria, sepsis, or other dangerous causes of fever. Ancient practitioners lack that distinction because the microbial cause remains invisible. Environmental observation is particularly important. Chinese physicians and administrators noticed that certain diseases appear seasonally or spread through communities. Climate, winds, dampness, cold, heat, food quality, and living conditions are incorporated into medical thought. Some explanations are framed in traditional cosmology, but the recognition that environment shapes illness is fundamentally sound. Mosquito-borne disease varies with weather and standing water. Respiratory infections spread differently according to season and crowding. Famine weakens resistance. Floods contaminate water supplies. The mechanism is misunderstood, but the pattern is real. Epidemic disease forces this tradition to adapt. Over time, Chinese medical writers develop categories for widespread febrile illnesses that seem to move rapidly through populations. Later schools place greater emphasis on contagious or epidemic conditions as distinct clinical problems. The exact evolution of these ideas is complicated, and scholars still debate how ancient descriptions map onto modern diseases. A fever recorded in a text could represent influenza, malaria, typhoid-like illness, respiratory infection, or something else entirely. As elsewhere, the household remains the first line of defense. Families prepare broths and herbal teas. The ill are allowed to rest. Bedding is changed. Food is adjusted. Caregivers watch for worsening symptoms. Many patients recover because the immune system ultimately controls the infection. When they do, the treatment used at the time receives credit, whether or not it caused the recovery. This is one of the great difficulties shared by every ancient medical tradition. Recovery can make an ineffective remedy look powerful. Death can make a useful treatment look useless. Without controlled trials, comparison groups, or microbiology, cause and coincidence are almost impossible to separate. Yet careful observation still pushes medicine forward. Far to the west, Greek physicians will take another step. They will increasingly argue that disease can be explained without relying entirely on divine punishment or hostile spirits. Their answers will often be wrong, but the attempt itself will reshape medical history, because illness will begin to be treated as something governed by nature, and therefore something that nature itself might reveal. In the Greek world, illness begins to undergo a subtle but important change in meaning. Gods do not disappear from medicine, temples do not empty, and ordinary people do not suddenly stop praying when fever enters a household. Religious healing continues to matter deeply, especially in sanctuaries associated with Asclepius, where the sick seek purification, ritual care, rest, and divine assistance. Yet alongside this world, a different kind of explanation becomes increasingly influential. Disease can be treated as something arising from nature itself, from the condition of the body, from food, water, climate, season, and environment, rather than solely from supernatural punishment. The explanations that follow are often wrong, but the decision to search for natural causes changes the direction of medical thought. The collection of writings traditionally associated with Hippocrates reflects this shift. Although the texts were produced by multiple authors over time rather than by one man alone, they reveal disagreement, experimentation, and competing medical ideas rather than a single neat doctrine. Some writings focus on prognosis, others discuss diet, surgery, epidemics, fractures, environmental conditions, or the expected course of disease. What connects many of them is attention to observation. The physician is encouraged to watch what the body is doing and to recognize patterns that may indicate whether the patient is likely to recover. Fever becomes especially important because it appears in so many illnesses. Greek physicians notice its timing, intensity, and recurrence. They describe fevers that seem continuous, others that rise and fall, and still others that return at regular intervals. In regions where malaria is present, recurrent fever patterns would have been familiar, although matching every ancient description to a modern disease is difficult. The same symptom can result from many infections. An ancient terminology does not map cleanly onto modern diagnostic categories. Scholars still debate the identity of numerous diseases described in classical texts. The Greeks increasingly interpret illness through humoral theory, which becomes one of the most influential medical frameworks in history. Health is understood as a balance among bodily fluids commonly identified as blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease results when these humours become excessive, deficient, corrupted, or improperly distributed. Heat, cold, dryness, moisture, seasons, diet, age, and temperament all supposedly influence this internal balance. Modern medicine rejects humoral physiology. There are no four humours regulating disease in the way ancient physicians imagined. Yet the theory offers something attractive. It creates a natural system that appears to explain many different symptoms without invoking a new supernatural cause for every illness. Fever can be understood as part of a bodily process. Treatment can therefore aim to restore balance through diet, rest, bathing, exercise, drugs, vomiting, purging, or bloodletting. Some of these treatments are relatively harmless and sometimes useful. A sick person might be given lighter foods, fluids, rest, and careful nursing. Physicians often pay close attention to what patients eat and drink, especially during acute illness. A feverish person who continues receiving water and simple nourishment has a better chance of surviving many infections than someone subjected to severe dehydration or starvation. Greek medicine also places considerable value on prognosis, which can help distinguish a patient who is improving from one approaching a crisis. Other treatments are much more dangerous. Bloodletting follows logically from humoral theory if excess blood is believed to cause disease. Purging may be used when harmful substances are thought to need removal. In a healthy patient, modest blood loss may be survived easily. In someone already weakened by infection, anemia, dehydration, or internal bleeding, it can make the situation far worse. The tragic problem is that a coherent theory can make harmful treatment appear reasonable. Greek physicians also become interested in the environment in a systematic way. One influential strand of medical thought links disease patterns with water sources, winds, seasons, landscape, and local climate. This reasoning contains both accurate observations and mistaken mechanisms. Different water sources genuinely do affect health if some are contaminated. Marshlands genuinely are associated with particular fevers in regions where mosquitoes breed. Seasonal weather genuinely changes the spread of respiratory infections and vector-borne diseases, but without knowledge of microorganisms or insect transmission, physicians explain these relationships through air quality, bodily balance, or environmental influence rather than pathogens. This concern with air contributes to ideas that later become known broadly as miasmatic thinking. The belief that foul or corrupted air causes disease. Bad smells from swamps, rotting material, sewage, and corpses seem strongly associated with sickness, making the idea persuasive. Sometimes avoiding foul environments really does reduce risk, but not because smell itself is the pathogen. A marsh may be dangerous because of mosquitoes. Sewage may be dangerous because fecal organisms contaminate food or water. The smell is only a visible or sensory clue pointing toward an unseen biological hazard. Despite theoretical errors, Greek medicine develops practical expertise in trauma. Physicians treat fractures, dislocations, wounds, and battlefield injuries, splints, bandaging, manipulation of joints, and surgical techniques can provide genuine benefit. The body's structure is visible enough for empirical skill to accumulate even when internal physiology remains mysterious. A broken bone aligned reasonably well has a better chance of healing with useful function. A wound kept cleaner and protected is less likely to be repeatedly contaminated. Physicians also distinguish between conditions they believe can be treated and those for which intervention may be futile. This restraint is a lesser-known but important feature of some Hippocratic writings. The healer's reputation depends partly on recognizing the limits of medicine. A physician who attempts dramatic intervention in every hopeless case risks both the patient and his own standing. Such pragmatism may spare some dying people from painful procedures, although it can also mean that those judged incurable receive little active treatment. Religious medicine continues alongside all of this. At healing sanctuaries, patients bathe, rest, make offerings, and participate in rituals. Some may experience improvement simply because they sleep, eat, relax, and temporarily leave stressful surroundings. Others recover naturally and attribute the result to divine intervention. The success stories are remembered, while failures leave fewer triumphant inscriptions. This pattern is not unique to religion. It affects every ancient therapeutic system. The Greek contribution, then, is not the discovery of modern medicine. It is the growing insistence that disease follows patterns that can be watched, compared, and explained through natural processes. That idea survives even after humoral theory itself becomes obsolete. Rome will inherit much of this Greek medical tradition, including both its strengths and its errors. But Roman society adds something larger than the individual physician, an urban world of aqueducts, sewers, baths, army hospitals, roads, and immense population centres. Medicine is about to become entangled with infrastructure on a scale the ancient Mediterranean has never seen before. By the time Rome dominates much of the Mediterranean world, sickness is no longer confined to villages, small towns, or isolated courts. It moves through some of the largest cities humanity has yet created. Rome itself grows into a metropolis of extraordinary density, filled with apartment blocks, workshops, markets, temples, warehouses, public baths, fountains, animals, refuse, smoke, and people arriving from across an empire that stretches through Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia. Roman engineers become famous for controlling water and waste on an immense scale, and these systems genuinely improve some aspects of urban life. Yet the same empire that builds aqueducts and sewers also creates perfect pathways for disease to travel over long distances. Aqueducts are among Rome's most impressive achievements. They bring enormous quantities of fresh water into cities from springs and distant sources, supplying fountains, baths, households, workshops, and public facilities. In a world where contaminated water can spread devastating intestinal disease, access to cleaner sources can provide a major advantage. But Roman water systems are not equivalent to modern treated municipal supplies. Water is not routinely disinfected, and contamination can occur during storage, distribution, or at the point of use. Some neighbourhoods receive better access than others. Wealth, location, and infrastructure all shape the quality of what reaches a household. Sewers offer similar contradictions. The Cloaca Maxima and other drainage systems remove wastewater and storm runoff from parts of Rome, reducing standing filth and improving the physical environment. Latrines become common in many urban settings, and public facilities are among the most recognizable features of Roman sanitation. Yet sewage often ends up in rivers or other nearby water systems. Public latrines are shared by large numbers of people, and evidence suggests that intestinal parasites remain widespread despite impressive engineering. Roman sanitation reduces some hazards without eliminating the biological world responsible for disease. Public baths illustrate this mixture even more clearly. Bathing can remove dirt, sweat, and some pathogens from skin. Romans value bathing as a social and cultural routine, and urban bath complexes can be vast. But warm communal water and crowded facilities are not automatically hygienic. Pools are used by many people, and water circulation varies. Fungal infections, skin conditions, and parasites can still spread. The idea that frequent bathing necessarily makes an ancient population medically safe is as misleading as the opposite stereotype that the ancient world never washed. Roman medicine itself is heavily influenced by Greek traditions. Greek-speaking physicians work throughout the empire, and humoral ideas remain central. One of the most influential figures is Galen, whose writings on anatomy, physiology, drugs, diagnosis, and treatment will shape medicine for more than 1,000 years. Galen is an extraordinarily careful observer in some areas and deeply mistaken in others. His anatomical knowledge comes partly from animal dissection because human dissection is limited, leading him to apply structures observed in animals to the human body. Even so, his vast body of work creates an authoritative medical system that later generations will preserve with remarkable loyalty. For fever, Roman physicians continue to pay close attention to patterns. They notice whether fever is continuous or intermittent, whether chills precede heat, whether sweating follows, and how appetite, sleep, pulse, breathing, urine, and mental state change. Malaria is probably a major presence in parts of Italy and the Mediterranean. especially in marshy regions. Recurrent fevers become familiar enough to be described according to their rhythm. What physicians cannot see is the parasite moving between mosquito and human blood. Treatment remains largely supportive or humoral. Patients may receive altered diets, fluids, rest, herbal preparations, baths, purging, or bloodletting. Some drugs relieve symptoms, others do little. A few can cause serious toxicity. As before, many patients survive because their immune systems defeat the infection, while treatment helps them endure the worst phase. The physician may interpret recovery as restored humoral balance, when the decisive process is happening at the microscopic level. Roman military medicine adds another important layer. Armies cannot function if wounded or sick soldiers are simply abandoned. Archaeological evidence from military sites includes structures commonly interpreted as hospitals, often called valetudinaria, especially in permanent forts. These buildings contain rooms arranged around corridors or courtyards and suggest organized care for soldiers. Military physicians and medics gain repeated experience with cuts, fractures, puncture wounds, infections, and surgery. A campaign creates a grim but effective training ground for trauma medicine. Roman surgical instruments reveal considerable technical skill. Scalpels, probes, forceps, hooks, needles, and other tools survive archaeologically. Surgeons can remove foreign objects, drain abscesses, stitch wounds in some circumstances, and perform procedures that require steady hands and anatomical familiarity. Certain operations have a realistic chance of helping. Draining a collection of pus, for example, can relieve pressure and reduce the burden of local infection. But without antisepsis, anesthesia as understood today, or antibiotics, surgery carries frightening risks. Wine and vinegar are sometimes used in cleaning wounds or instruments. Their acidic or alcoholic content can inhibit some microbes under certain conditions, but ancient concentrations and techniques vary too much to treat them as reliable sterilization. Honey, oils, resins, and plant preparations also appear in wound treatment. The important point is that Roman caregivers often do attempt to clean and protect injuries. Even partial reduction of contamination can improve the odds of survival. Diet is considered another form of medicine. Roman physicians may prescribe foods according to humoral theory, choosing lighter or heavier meals depending on the illness. Broths, diluted wine, water, grains, fruits, and other foods can provide hydration and calories. Some recommendations are sensible simply because a severely ill person needs energy without excessive digestive burden. Others reflect theoretical categories with no physiological basis. The empire's greatest medical achievement may therefore lie less in individual cures than in organization. Water can be brought from distant sources. Waste can be moved away. Soldiers can be treated in dedicated facilities. Physicians can travel between cities. Medical texts circulate. Pharmacological knowledge from Egypt, Greece, Asia Minor, North Africa, and other regions enters shared networks. Rome turns health into something that can be supported by infrastructure. Yet those same networks create vulnerability. Roads move armies and physicians, but they also move infected travelers. Ports connect the Mediterranean, but ships carry rats, fleas, parasites, and sick passengers. Grain convoys feed cities while tying distant ecosystems together. An outbreak that once might have remained local can now move along imperial routes with remarkable speed. Rome has constructed one of the most connected human worlds ever seen. Soon that connectivity will reveal its darker side. When epidemic disease enters the imperial network, aqueducts, baths, physicians, and centuries of medical learning will prove incapable of stopping forces that no one can yet see. The first signs of a great epidemic rarely announce themselves as history. They appear as ordinary sickness multiplied too quickly. A soldier develops fever, a household loses several members within days, a port city begins reporting unusual deaths. Physicians see symptoms they recognize individually, but not in such numbers. Funerals increase, markets thin. Travelers carry stories ahead of themselves, and eventually the pattern becomes impossible to dismiss. In the ancient world, this is the moment when medicine reaches its most terrifying limit, because even sophisticated societies possess almost no reliable way to stop an infection once it begins moving through a dense and connected population. The Roman Empire experiences several major epidemic crises, but one of the most famous begins in the 2nd century CE, during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. The outbreak, traditionally called the Antonine Plague, spreads through parts of the empire from around 165 CE and appears in waves for years. Ancient descriptions have led many modern scholars to suspect smallpox, though the identification is not absolutely certain. Symptoms attributed to the epidemic include fever, gastrointestinal distress, and skin eruptions, but ancient medical descriptions do not provide the laboratory evidence required for definitive diagnosis. What is clear is that the disease causes severe mortality and reaches communities linked by military and commercial movement. The timing is no accident. Roman armies are operating across vast distances. Troops move between frontier zones and major cities. Ships connect eastern Mediterranean ports with Italy, North Africa, and beyond. Roads designed to allow rapid imperial communication also function as channels for infection. A pathogen does not need to understand geography. It only needs one susceptible host to reach the next stopping point. Galen lives through the epidemic and records observations related to the disease. His descriptions are valuable but incomplete, and they cannot reveal the causative organism. Roman doctors can identify the progression of symptoms, perhaps distinguish patients who are worsening from those recovering, and offer treatments based on diet, humoral balance, drugs, or supportive care. What they cannot do is interrupt viral replication, provide modern respiratory support, or vaccinate a population. The body either develops an effective immune response or it does not. This creates a strange pattern in which ancient medical care can still matter while remaining powerless against the epidemic as a whole. A patient who receives fluid, food, warmth, clean bedding, and attention may survive an illness that kills someone neglected. A secondary wound infection might be treated locally. Pain can sometimes be eased, but no physician can walk into a crowded district and stop transmission at its source. The consequences extend far beyond medicine. Epidemics remove workers from farms and workshops. Soldiers fall ill. Tax revenues weaken. Families lose caregivers. Trade can contract as travelers avoid affected areas or because transport networks themselves lose workers. It would be too simple to claim that the Antonine Plague alone caused Roman decline. The empire continues for centuries, and historians debate the scale of mortality and its long-term effects. Still, severe epidemic disease adds stress to systems already dependent on constant movement and labor. Centuries later, another epidemic demonstrates the same vulnerability on an even more famous scale. Beginning in the 6th century CE, during the reign of Emperor Justinian, a pandemic known as the Justinianic Plague affects the Eastern Roman or Byzantine world and regions far beyond it. Modern ancient DNA studies have identified the bacterium Yersinia pestis in remains associated with outbreaks from this period, firmly connecting at least parts of the pandemic with plague. This is the same bacterial species responsible for the later Black Death, although particular strains, environmental contexts, and transmission dynamics differ across outbreaks. Yersinia pestis can circulate among rodent populations and can be transmitted to humans through fleas under many circumstances. Pneumonic forms can also spread between people through respiratory droplets. Ancient observers, however, see none of this. They see swollen lymph nodes, fever, weakness, delirium, and sudden death. The historian Procopius describes the epidemic in Constantinople with dramatic detail, including the enormous burden of the dead. His numbers and literary framing must be treated cautiously, as with all ancient narrative sources. But there is little doubt that the outbreak causes severe disruption. Burial systems become overwhelmed. Normal routines falter. Fear spreads alongside infection. Treatment options are painfully limited. Some physicians may lance swellings or apply poultices. Patients receive food, drink, oils, herbs, prayer, or whatever household remedies are available. None of these treatments can reliably eliminate Yersinia pestis from the bloodstream. Without antibiotics, bubonic plague can be highly lethal, while septicemic and pneumonic forms can be even more dangerous. Yet not everyone dies. This fact is crucial to understanding how ancient societies survive epidemics at all. Infectious diseases rarely kill every exposed person. Some never become infected. Some receive lower infectious doses. Some possess biological traits that influence immune response. Some are healthier at the moment of exposure. Others survive because the disease remains localized or because supportive care sustains them through the critical period. Chance also plays a large role. Communities respond in ways shaped by both observation and belief. People may flee affected cities, though flight can carry disease elsewhere. Houses containing the sick may be avoided. Travelers are treated with suspicion. Religious processions, prayers, offerings, and public rituals become common responses because epidemic disease appears to demand an explanation larger than individual medicine. Unfortunately, gathering people together for communal rituals can also increase transmission in some circumstances. The psychological effect is enormous. Ordinary rules of social life become unstable when contact itself may be dangerous. Caring for a sick relative can mean risking infection. Refusing care can mean abandoning someone who might otherwise survive. Ancient societies repeatedly confront this moral conflict without knowing how disease spreads. The instinct to help, one of humanity's oldest medical tools, becomes dangerous precisely when it is needed most. Even burial creates risk depending on the pathogen and circumstances, though plague transmission from corpses is more complicated than popular imagination often suggests. Fleas leaving dying hosts may seek new animals or humans, and people handling bodies in crowded environments face many forms of exposure. Mass mortality also contaminates living conditions indirectly by overwhelming sanitation and food systems. The great epidemics reveal that ancient medicine is strongest when disease is local and visible: a fracture, a wound, an abscess, a digestive problem, a mild fever that resolves with rest. It is weakest when infection operates as a population-level phenomenon. No herbal recipe can compensate for not knowing that fleas carry bacteria. No humoral theory can reveal viral transmission. No aqueduct can protect a city if infection is arriving continuously through human movement. Still, these disasters leave behind lessons. Communities begin to remember that movement matters, that contact can be dangerous, that certain places should sometimes be avoided, and that disease can travel along the same routes as commerce. Those observations will take centuries to develop into formal quarantine and public health practice. By the medieval period, medicine will still inherit much from Greece and Rome, including humoral theory and bloodletting, but it will also inherit hospitals, monastic care, household herbal traditions, religious charity, and generations of hard-earned experience with epidemic disease. The result is not the medical darkness often imagined, but something more complicated, a world capable of careful nursing and practical prevention, while still trapped inside explanations that cannot yet reveal the invisible enemy. By the medieval period, the fight against fever and disease is often described as if Europe had forgotten everything the ancient world knew and replaced medicine with superstition. The reality is far less simple. Greek and Roman medical traditions survive in manuscripts, monasteries, urban schools, and later universities. Medical knowledge from the Islamic world, Byzantium, and earlier Mediterranean traditions continues to circulate through translation and exchange. At the same time, most sick people are never treated by a university-trained physician. They are cared for in households, religious institutions, villages, military communities, and towns by relatives, herbal practitioners, midwives, barber surgeons, monks, nuns, and other caregivers whose skills vary enormously. Medieval medicine is not one system but many overlapping ways of surviving illness. Humoral theory remains deeply influential. Fever is often interpreted through imbalance among the traditional humours, and treatment may aim to remove excess material or restore proper balance. Bloodletting becomes one of the most recognizable practices associated with medieval medicine. It can be performed by physicians, surgeons, or barber surgeons, sometimes according to detailed rules involving seasoned age, symptoms, and even astrological considerations. From a modern perspective, routine bloodletting offers no general cure for infection and can be dangerous, particularly when a patient is already dehydrated, anemic, or critically ill. Yet the procedure survives because it makes sense within the dominant theory of the body, and because some patients recover afterward for reasons unrelated to the blood loss. Purging operates according to similar logic. Laxatives, emetics, enemas, and dietary restrictions are used to remove substances thought to be harmful. Some ingredients genuinely affect digestion, but aggressive purging can worsen fluid loss during fever or gastrointestinal disease. Once again, the problem is not that medieval healers are incapable of observing patients. It is that observation is interpreted through a framework that makes harmful interventions appear rational. Alongside these practices exists something far more valuable: nursing. Monasteries, convents, charitable foundations, and later hospitals provide places where the sick can receive food, shelter, warmth, washing, and attention. Medieval hospitals are not modern medical centres. Many function partly as religious charities, shelters for travellers, homes for the poor, or places of long-term care. Nevertheless, they can give vulnerable people something essential that ancient households have always understood: a protected place to remain while the body attempts to recover. Monastic communities are particularly important in preserving written medical material and cultivating plants used in household remedies. Herb gardens may contain sage, fennel, mint, rue, rosemary, lavender, and numerous other plants depending on region and period. Some are used primarily as foods or flavorings, others for digestive complaints, wounds, pain, sleep, or fever. A few contain compounds with useful effects. Others provide little benefit or carry risks. It is easy for modern retellings to turn every medieval herb into a scientifically validated drug, but the evidence does not support that romantic picture. Traditional plant knowledge is a mixture of useful experience, cultural belief, and repeated error. Honey continues to appear in wound care, and this is one area where ancient experience can genuinely align with modern microbiology. Under appropriate conditions, honey can inhibit the growth of certain bacteria and help wounds maintain a favorable healing environment. Medieval practitioners do not know why. The treatment survives because it is available, sticky enough to hold dressings, culturally familiar, and apparently helpful in some cases. Wine and vinegar also appear in cleaning and medicinal preparations. Their acidity or alcohol may reduce some microorganisms, but concentrations vary greatly, and neither should be imagined as dependable medieval sterilization. Washing wounds, replacing dirty dressings, and draining abscesses are often more important than the symbolic meaning attached to whatever liquid is used. Surgery occupies an uncertain position. Barber surgeons and other practitioners deal with injuries, fractures, abscesses, amputations, and battlefield trauma. They possess practical anatomical knowledge accumulated through repeated exposure to the body. A surgeon who has treated hundreds of wounds can become highly skilled even while accepting humoral theory. But every operation risks catastrophic infection. Instruments are reused. Hands are not sterilized according to germ theory. Deep wounds can become contaminated with organisms from skin, soil, cloth, or metal. A technically successful procedure may therefore kill the patient days later through sepsis. Medieval people also develop important habits of cleanliness, although these vary widely by place, class, period, and circumstance. The stereotype that everyone lives permanently coated in filth is misleading. Bathhouses exist in many medieval towns. Washing is common in numerous contexts. Linens are cleaned, floors are swept, and hands may be washed before meals. Yet urban sanitation remains difficult. Animals move through streets. Waste accumulates. Wells can be contaminated. And crowded housing allows lice, fleas, respiratory infections, and gastrointestinal disease to spread. Religious ideas shape health strongly. Illness may be interpreted as a test, punishment, spiritual trial, or part of divine order. Saints are associated with particular diseases. Pilgrims visit shrines seeking healing. Relics and prayers are used alongside physical remedies. These practices have no direct ability to eliminate pathogens, but they can create networks of care and charity. Religious duty encourages communities to feed the sick, shelter strangers, establish hospitals, and tend the dying. The same worldview that generates supernatural explanations can therefore also support practical caregiving. The Islamic medical world contributes enormously to the preservation, criticism, and expansion of earlier medical knowledge during the medieval centuries. Physicians working in cities from Baghdad to Cairo and Cordoba translate Greek texts, write extensive medical encyclopedias, study drugs, establish hospitals, and develop clinical traditions that later influence European medicine. Figures such as Al-Razi and Ibn Sina become authoritative far beyond their own regions. Their medicine still rests partly on humoral ideas, but it also values systematic observation and pharmacology. This exchange makes the medieval medical landscape far more interconnected than older narratives of isolated civilization suggest. Perhaps the most significant development is the gradual recognition that certain diseases require separation. Leprosy, or conditions grouped under that label, can lead to forms of social exclusion. During outbreaks of other diseases, towns sometimes restrict entry or isolate households. These actions are inconsistent and are often motivated by fear or religious concepts of impurity rather than an understanding of transmission. Still, they preserve an increasingly important observation. Physical distance can change what happens during an epidemic. That observation will soon become unavoidable. In the 14th century, a disease arrives with such speed and mortality that inherited medicine seems almost powerless before it. Physicians will consult humors, stars, air, diet, and ancient authorities. Families will use herbs, prayer, smoke, isolation, flight, and every remedy available. Some measures will accidentally help. Many will do nothing. Others will make conditions worse. The Black Death will not create the idea that disease can spread between people, but it will force governments and communities to confront that possibility on a scale Europe and the Mediterranean world can no longer ignore. When the Black Death reaches Europe in the middle of the 14th century, it does not arrive as a single terrifying moment. It advances through ports, roads, markets, households, and armies, leaving behind patterns that become visible only after the disease is already established. A ship enters harbour with sick sailors. A merchant develops fever after returning home. Someone notices painful swellings beneath the arms or in the groin. Soon another household is affected, then another street, then an entire district. Within weeks, ordinary routines begin to fail, shops close, clergy, officials, labourers, and caregivers disappear from daily life. Burial grounds fill faster than communities can manage. Medieval medicine has faced epidemics before, but the scale of this catastrophe transforms disease from a private tragedy into a social emergency. The pandemic that strikes Eurasia and North Africa from the late 1340s is associated with Yersinia pestis, the same bacterial species identified in remains from the earlier Justinianic pandemic. Ancient DNA has provided strong evidence linking medieval plague victims to this pathogen. The details of transmission across different regions remain the subject of ongoing research, and scholars still debate the relative roles of rats, fleas, human ectoparasites, pneumonic spread, climate, and local ecology. No single explanation fully accounts for every outbreak. What is clear is that the disease moves rapidly through interconnected trade networks and can produce devastating mortality. Medieval physicians do not know any of this. They work within inherited theories involving humoral imbalance, corrupted air, planetary influence, environmental conditions, and divine meaning. Bad air becomes one of the most influential explanations. If disease appears where corpses, refuse, swamps, or foul smells are present, it is easy to imagine that poisoned atmosphere itself carries illness. Fires are lit, aromatic woods and herbs are burned. People carry scented substances or attempt to purify rooms with smoke and fragrance. Some of these measures are useless against plague. Others may accidentally influence insect behavior in very limited circumstances. But there is no evidence that fumigation practices provide reliable protection. Heavy indoor smoke can also worsen respiratory problems. Yet the reasoning is understandable if the danger seems to be in the air. Changing the air appears to be a logical response. Household treatments multiply. Patients may receive herbal mixtures, vinegar preparations, poultices, altered diets, purging, bleeding, or applications to swollen lymph nodes. Some practitioners attempt to lance buboes. Such intervention might occasionally drain infected material, but it cannot reliably stop systemic plague and may expose caregivers to contaminated fluids. Without antibiotics, a patient whose infection spreads into the bloodstream faces terrible odds. The most effective responses begin to emerge not from a better drug, but from changes in movement and contact. Communities gradually recognize that ships, travelers, goods, and infected households seem connected with outbreaks. Italian maritime cities become especially important in the development of organized isolation measures. In the later 14th century, authorities in places such as Ragusa, now Dubrovnik, imposed periods of separation on travelers arriving from plague-affected areas. Early restrictions are not always 40 days long, and the practices evolve over time, but they form part of the history that eventually produces the word quarantine. This is a remarkable turning point. Officials still do not know what a bacterium is. They cannot see fleas as disease vectors in the modern sense, yet they begin using time itself as a defensive tool. A traveller who remains separated long enough to develop symptoms can be identified before mixing freely with the local population. The method is imperfect, inconsistently enforced, economically disruptive, and based on incomplete understanding, but it marks a profound shift toward population-level prevention. Cities also begin developing more formal health administration. Some appoint officials responsible for monitoring outbreaks, regulating movement, supervising burial, inspecting travelers, or responding to suspicious illness. Over later centuries, boards of health and dedicated plague hospitals become more common in parts of Europe. Isolation facilities known as lazarettos appear around important ports. These institutions are not born from germ theory. They arise from repeated observation that controlling contact sometimes changes the course of an epidemic. Flight is another common response. Wealthier residents may leave cities for rural estates when disease appears. This can reduce an individual's exposure if departure happens early enough and the destination is unaffected. But fleeing populations can also carry infection into new areas. Poorer residents often lack the option entirely. Epidemic survival therefore becomes shaped by class as well as biology. Space, food, housing quality, occupation, and the ability to avoid crowded environments all influence risk. Caregivers face perhaps the greatest dilemma. The oldest human defense against sickness has always been proximity, bringing food, water, warmth, and comfort. During plague, proximity itself can become dangerous. A family member tending the sick may soon develop fever. Religious caregivers, physicians, servants, and burial workers face repeated exposure. Some flee, others stay, many die. Religious responses intensify as mortality rises. Processions, communal prayers, penance, pilgrimage, and public rituals attempt to make sense of catastrophe. These practices can offer psychological structure and social solidarity, but gathering large crowds may increase transmission of certain infections. Worse, fear sometimes turns towards scapegoating. Jewish communities and other minorities are falsely accused of causing disease, leading to persecution and massacre despite the complete absence of evidence. Epidemic ignorance does not only harm the sick, it can reshape violence within society. The Black Death also disrupts traditional confidence in authority. Learned physicians die alongside ordinary people. Remedies fail. Religious institutions lose enormous numbers of members. Communities witness apparently healthy people decline with terrifying speed. The experience does not instantly overthrow humoral medicine, but it leaves behind a powerful lesson. Inherited explanations are not enough. Survivors carry another kind of knowledge forward. They remember that closing gates can matter. They remember that infected ships can threaten entire ports. They remember that households can be isolated, that bedding and clothing associated with the sick may be dangerous, and that mass gatherings during outbreaks can carry risks even when the mechanism remains obscure. Over time, these observations help create public health practices increasingly separated from individual bedside treatment. Yet for most people, survival still depends on a combination of factors they cannot control. Some possess immunity shaped by prior exposure or individual biology. Some encounter a smaller infectious dose. Some escape heavily affected environments. Some receive better food and nursing. Others survive despite every disadvantage. Chance remains an enormous part of the story. The Black Death therefore teaches humanity something both grim and useful. When medicine cannot cure the individual, society can sometimes reduce exposure, separation, surveillance, controlled movement, and organized care begin to emerge as weapons against disease long before anyone sees the microbial enemy. Centuries will pass before microscopes, laboratory experiments, and germ theory explain why those weapons sometimes work. But once modern science finally looks back at ancient remedies, another question becomes possible among all the herbs, foods, poultices, washes, and habits accumulated across thousands of years. Which ones actually helped, and which survived only because people desperately wanted them to. Once modern laboratories begin testing substances that ancient healers used for centuries, the results are neither a complete vindication of traditional medicine nor a dismissal of it. Instead, they reveal something more interesting. Across thousands of years, people experimented with plants, minerals, animal products, heat, washing, food, rest, isolation, and wound care without understanding the microorganisms or physiological systems involved. Some practices survived because they genuinely helped. Others persisted because recovery happened naturally, and the remedy received the credit. Still others endured because they were embedded in religion, identity, or authority. Looking back with modern evidence makes it possible to separate at least some of these strands, though even now the picture remains incomplete. Honey is one of the clearest examples of an ancient remedy with legitimate medical value in specific circumstances. Used by several ancient societies in wound preparations, honey creates an environment in which many bacteria struggle to grow. Its low water availability, acidity, and production of antimicrobial compounds in certain varieties can all contribute. Modern medical-grade honey is still used in selected wound care settings. That does not mean honey from any ancient jar was automatically sterile, or that it could cure a systemic infection. A wound contaminated deeply with dangerous bacteria could still become fatal. Yet compared with leaving damaged tissue uncovered and dirty, the use of honey alongside cleaning and dressing may sometimes have improved survival. Washing wounds also appears almost painfully simple from a modern perspective, but its value is enormous. Removing dirt, foreign material, and damaged tissue can reduce the number of microorganisms present. Ancient caregivers who rinse a wound with relatively clean water do not understand bacterial load, but they may observe that heavily contaminated injuries tend to worsen. Wine or vinegar are sometimes added, and depending on concentration, they may inhibit some microbes. Although neither ancient wine nor vinegar can be treated as reliable surgical antiseptics, the crucial action may have been mechanical cleaning itself. Drainage provides another ancient practice with strong practical logic. Abscesses are enclosed collections of infected material, and opening them can reduce pressure and allow pus to escape. Surgeons in multiple ancient traditions learn to lance swellings, sometimes successfully. Modern medicine still uses drainage for many abscesses, though with sterile technique, pain control, and antibiotics when necessary. Ancient practitioners discover the visible principle long before they understand the microscopic cause. Certain plants also contain compounds capable of reducing symptoms. Willow bark and related species contain salicylate compounds connected chemically to the later development of aspirin. Their historical use for pain or fever in different cultures has therefore attracted considerable attention. But ancient preparations vary greatly in strength, and consuming plant material is not equivalent to taking a standardized modern drug. Salicylates can also cause gastrointestinal irritation, bleeding, and other complications. A remedy can be genuinely active without being predictably safe. The same pattern appears with Artemisia annua, the plant associated with Qinghao in Chinese medical history, and with the modern anti-malarial drug artemisinin. The discovery of artemisinin demonstrates that old medicinal traditions can contain valuable pharmacological clues. Yet modern success depends on identifying the active molecule, understanding its chemistry, standardizing dosage, testing effectiveness, and using appropriate combinations to reduce the development of resistance. The achievement is not proof that every traditional fever remedy works. It is evidence that systematic scientific investigation can uncover useful compounds hidden inside vast bodies of traditional experimentation. Garlic provides another interesting case. Laboratory studies show that compounds produced when garlic is crushed can inhibit certain microorganisms under controlled conditions. This has encouraged claims that ancient garlic remedies functioned as natural antibiotics. The reality is more limited. Activity in a laboratory dish does not mean consuming garlic can replace antibiotics for pneumonia, sepsis, or infected wounds. The concentration that reaches human tissues may be very different from what kills organisms experimentally. Ancient patients may still have gained nutritional or minor symptomatic benefits, but exaggerated claims can transform a plausible observation into mythology. Many herbs valued for digestion may have been useful in less dramatic ways. Ginger can reduce nausea in some situations. Mint can influence gastrointestinal sensation. Certain fiber-rich or mucilaginous plants may ease bowel discomfort. Warm herbal liquids can encourage hydration even when the plant itself has little effect on the underlying infection. For a patient with fever, maintaining fluid intake can be more important than the exotic ingredient dissolved in the cup. This is especially true for diarrheal disease. The great medical breakthrough for severe diarrhea is not a rare herb, but the realization that water combined with appropriate amounts of salts and glucose can be absorbed efficiently by the intestine, even during serious illness. Oral rehydration therapy is a modern, scientifically formulated treatment, and ancient societies did not possess its precise physiological understanding or standardized recipe. Yet whenever caregivers gave sick people water, broths, grain liquids, or lightly salted foods, they may sometimes have replaced part of what the body was losing. The difference between helpful hydration and dangerous imbalance is substantial, so ancient practice should not be equated with modern therapy. Still, the underlying survival principle is ancient: keep the patient drinking if possible. Rest is even harder to evaluate because it leaves almost no archaeological signature. Yet it is among the most consistent forms of ancient care. Fever raises metabolic demands. Fighting infection consumes energy. A person forced to continue heavy labor while ill may dehydrate, become injured, or fail to recover. Communities that allow sick members to remain sheltered effectively provide a treatment that requires no drug at all. Isolation is similarly powerful when used appropriately. Medieval quarantine eventually shows that separating potentially infected travelers can reduce the movement of some diseases. Earlier forms of avoiding sick households may have produced similar effects, but isolation is only beneficial when it matches the transmission route. A disease carried by mosquitoes will not necessarily be stopped by avoiding the patient. A contaminated well remains dangerous even if the sick person is confined indoors. Without germ theory, ancient societies cannot know which strategy fits which disease. Then there are treatments. Modern evidence clearly gives little reason to defend. Routine bloodletting for fever can weaken patients. Aggressive purging can worsen dehydration. Toxic metals and minerals can poison the body. Burning large quantities of material in enclosed spaces can damage the lungs. Restricting water during fever can be disastrous. Magical objects do not kill bacteria or viruses. The survival of these practices reminds us that tradition is not the same thing as evidence. Yet dismissing ancient healers as foolish misses the deeper pattern. They were working with extraordinarily limited tools while observing complicated biological systems. Most infections resolve naturally, meaning cause and effect are difficult to identify even for careful observers. When 10 people receive the same remedy and 8 recover, the treatment appears successful even if 8 would have recovered without it. Without controlled trials, placebo comparison, microbiology, and statistical methods, misleading conclusions are almost inevitable. What modern science reveals is therefore less a story of lost cures than a story of partial success. Ancient people discover individual pieces of effective care clean the wound, drain the abscess, provide fluids, feed the weak, use certain active plants, protect the patient, and reduce dangerous contact. They do not know how these pieces fit together, and that leaves the final mystery. If ancient medicine so often misunderstood disease, why did human populations survive repeated epidemics, infected injuries, malaria, parasites, childbirth complications, and countless fevers for thousands of years? The answer lies not in one miraculous remedy, but in the interaction between biology, caregiving, accumulated knowledge, social cooperation, and an immune system far older than medicine itself. The deepest reason ancient people survive fever and disease is not that their remedies are secretly equivalent to modern medicine. It is that the human body enters history already carrying an immensely old defense system. Long before anyone knows the word infection, immune cells are detecting damaged tissue, recognizing foreign molecules, producing inflammatory signals, attacking pathogens, and building forms of memory after exposure. Fever itself is part of this inherited biological machinery. It can make the internal environment less favorable for certain microorganisms while coordinating elements of immune response. Ancient healers do not create this system. Their greatest successes often come from helping the patient remain alive while it does its work. That distinction changes the way ancient recovery should be understood. If a person with a self-limiting viral infection receives an herbal drink, lies beside a warm fire, sleeps for several days, and eventually recovers, the herb may receive the credit. Sometimes it deserves part of it, perhaps because it reduces pain or nausea. Sometimes its main contribution is simply encouraging fluid intake. Sometimes it contributes nothing at all. The decisive struggle occurs inside the patient. where immune defenses gradually gain control. Ancient medicine often functions not as a direct weapon against disease, but as support around the edges of that battle. Nutrition matters enormously. Immune responses require energy and raw materials. Populations weakened by famine, prolonged malnutrition, or repeated crop failure are often more vulnerable to infection. A household with stored grain, dried fruit, animal products, or other reliable foods can support someone who cannot work for several days. This seemingly ordinary reserve may make the difference between recovery and collapse. Agriculture increases exposure to new diseases, but it also creates food storage on scales mobile societies rarely maintain. Once again, the same historical development produces danger and protection at the same time. Water is even more immediate. A feverish adult can lose large amounts of fluid through sweating, rapid breathing, vomiting, or diarrhea. A child can deteriorate much faster. Ancient caregivers who continue bringing water or thin food to a patient are performing one of the simplest and most important acts in the history of medicine. They do not understand blood volume, kidney function, or electrolytes. They simply see that a person who cannot drink becomes weaker in countless unnamed households. Survival probably depends less on a famous physician than on someone repeatedly carrying a cup. Age shapes the odds as well. Infants and young children face especially severe risks from diarrheal disease, respiratory infection, and fever. Older adults may carry acquired immunity to diseases encountered earlier in life, but age can also weaken resilience. A person who survives one infection may gain lasting immunity, temporary protection, or only partial resistance depending on the pathogen. At the population level, this creates complicated patterns. An epidemic may be devastating when it first reaches a community, and less severe when survivors later encounter related strains, though no universal rule applies. Genetics adds another layer. Over many generations, infectious diseases can influence which genetic variants become more common. The most famous examples include traits connected with malaria. Certain variants affecting red blood cells can reduce the severity of malaria in particular genetic combinations, while causing serious disease in others. This is not evidence that human evolution perfectly solves infection. It shows something harsher. Natural selection can favor a costly biological compromise if it improves survival enough in a dangerous environment. Other immune-related genes also preserve traces of ancient evolutionary pressures, though connecting a specific variant to a particular prehistoric epidemic can be extraordinarily difficult. Human populations have mixed, migrated, experienced repeated bottlenecks, and encountered countless pathogens. The evidence remains incomplete. What can be said with confidence is that infectious disease has been a major evolutionary force, shaping both human biology and human behavior. Social behavior may be just as important. Humans rarely face sickness alone. They share food, protect injured companions, watch over children, maintain fires, transport the weak, and accumulate knowledge across generations. This creates risks because social contact can spread infection, but it also creates one of the most powerful survival systems available before modern medicine. A solitary primate with severe fever may be unable to find water. A human with several caregivers can remain sheltered for days and still receive food and protection. The archaeological evidence for long-term survival with disability makes this social dimension visible across deep time. A healed fracture is not merely bone repairing itself. It can also represent weeks during which someone could not hunt normally, travel quickly, or defend themselves. Recovery requires biology, but often it also requires tolerance from the group. The same pattern extends to disease even though fever leaves fewer marks on skeletons. Human compassion, obligation, kinship, and cooperation become medical technologies before technology in the usual sense exists. Accumulated knowledge strengthens that cooperation. Every generation inherits observations from earlier ones. Some are correct, some are wrong. Some become ritualized until no one remembers why they began. A grandmother knows which liquid a feverish child will accept. A healer recognizes the smell of a badly infected wound. A soldier knows that a swollen injury must be opened before it worsens. A town official learns that ships arriving from an epidemic region should not immediately unload passengers into crowded streets. None possesses the whole explanation, but each carries a piece. This is why the history of disease should not be told as a simple progression from ignorance to knowledge. Ancient medicine contains sophistication and error at every stage. An Egyptian wound dressing may help while an incantation beside it does nothing biologically. A Greek physician may observe fever patterns brilliantly and then weaken the patient through bloodletting. A medieval household may trust a useless amulet while carefully keeping a sick person warm and hydrated. A quarantine imposed for the wrong theoretical reason may nevertheless slow transmission. Survival therefore emerges from layers rather than breakthroughs. Biology provides immunity. Families provide nursing. Landscapes provide medicinal substances. Communities provide stored food. Experience provides memory. Infrastructure provides cleaner water or waste removal. Governments eventually provide isolation and epidemic control. Chance determines who is exposed and how severely. None of these factors works perfectly, but together they allow populations to endure losses that would otherwise be even greater. The cost remains almost impossible to comprehend. For most of human history, infections that are now routinely treatable can kill without warning. A small wound can become septic. Childbirth can introduce fatal infection. Pneumonia can overwhelm a healthy adult. Diarrhea can kill a child in days. Malaria can return year after year. Plague can empty streets. People survive, but survival should never be confused with safety. What makes the story remarkable is not that ancient people defeat disease. They rarely do. They endure it. They learn just enough to improve the odds. They keep alive fragments of useful knowledge long before anyone can explain why those fragments work. And they build social worlds in which the sick are often worth caring for even when caring carries a cost. Modern medicine eventually changes those odds through germ theory, vaccination, antibiotics, sanitation, controlled trials, intensive care, and a detailed understanding of physiology. Yet beneath those achievements remain behaviors that are far older, offering water, cleaning a wound, providing shelter, noticing patterns, isolating danger, and staying beside someone until the fever breaks. The oldest medicine, in the end, is not a forgotten drug. It is the decision to keep another human being alive long enough for recovery to remain possible. The fire beside the shelter has burned lower now. Across thousands of years, the scene changes almost beyond recognition. Yet something within it remains familiar. The shelter becomes a mud brick house, then a stone room beside the Nile, a chamber in Mesopotamia, a Greek household, a Roman military hospital, a monastery infirmary, a crowded medieval home. The containers change, the medicines change, the explanations change, but beside the bed there is still a cup of water, a folded cloth, a hand checking the heat of a forehead, and someone watching through the night. Most of the people who performed those acts have vanished without names. Their remedies were rarely written down. Their failures left no monuments. Their successes often looked so ordinary that history had little reason to preserve them. Yet every generation that survived carried something forward from those quiet rooms, immune memory within bodies, practical memory within communities, and the stubborn habit of caring for people when the cause of suffering remained invisible. For much of the human past, fever must have felt like a visitor from another world. It arrived unseen, changed the body from within, and sometimes disappeared as suddenly as it came. People gave it gods, spirits, humours, poisoned air, curses, seasons, and countless other explanations because a mystery that dangerous demanded meaning. They were often wrong about the cause, but they were not always wrong about what helped a frightened body endure. Time eventually reveals the microorganisms they could never see. It explains why dirty water could kill, why mosquitoes mattered, why isolation sometimes worked, why certain plants contained useful chemicals, and why so many trusted treatments accomplished nothing. Yet that knowledge does not erase the long era before it. It makes the survival of that era more extraordinary. Somewhere in the deep past, a sick person once lay near a fading fire while the rest of the group continued bringing food and water. No record tells us who that person was, what illness caused the fever, or whether any herb beside them had real medicinal value. Perhaps they recovered, perhaps they did not. But someone stayed. And across the immense distance between that fire and the modern hospital, that simple act remains one of the oldest threads in the human story.